Alrighty. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us today for Fiction, Truth, and Female Genital Cutting, a Fireside Chat with Farzana Doctor. My name is Kate Cox. I'm the program's intern at Sahiyo. During our conversation today, you guys are going to get the chance to hear from award-winning Canadian novelist Farzana Doctor about her latest book, 7. Today, we're also joined by Mariya Taher, the co-founder of Sahiyo, which is a nonprofit organization aimed at ending FGC. The Q&A between Mariya and Farzana will explore the major themes of 7, such as the intricacies of sexuality, marriage, female friendship, cultural norms, and the ongoing fight to end khatna, or FGC. Thank you all so much.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you, Kate, for introducing us. So hi, everybody. My name is Mariya. I am the co-founder of Sahiyo, as Kate mentioned. And just to give you a little bit of context on who I am and what Sahiyo does, I've been working in the gender-based violence field for over a decade in the areas of teaching, research, policy, program implementation, in everything from domestic violence to sexual assault to, of course, female genital mutilation / cutting, or as I'll refer to it, FGC. And I'm also one of the 5 co-founders of Sahiyo, and I sit on the steering committee for the US and FGMC network. And I currently live in Massachusetts and I'm actively involved in working in Massachusetts we just passed legislation to protect girls from FGMC this past August, but also working to build community education outreach programs in the state. And I'm also a writer and a social worker, so I'm really excited to have Farzana on today. I have received my MFA from Lesley University and my Master's of Social Work from San Francisco State University. So to give you some info about Sahiyo, Sahiyo is the Bohra Gujarati word for female friend, and it really does reflect our organization's mission to empower Asian and other communities to end female genital cutting and create positive social change through dialogue, education, and collaboration, really based on community involvement. And our organization began in 2015 as a conversation between 5 women who just felt very passionate about the issue of FGC. It practiced particularly in the Bohra community. And each of us in our own capacity had been advocating against this for quite a few years, but as our collaboration grew, we really recognized the need for an organized, informed forum that could help drive a collective movement to abandon this harmful practice from within the community itself. Over time, Sahiyo has expanded our programming to include other FGC practicing communities besides the Bohra community. And then we also divided into 2 legal entities, Sahiyo US and Sahiyo India. Sahiyo US really does focus on communities throughout the US and Canada and other diaspora regions in the world too, where Bohra communities and other Asian communities have dispersed to. And currently we are one of the few organizations working globally that really highlights the issue of FGC within the Asian communities. WeSpeakOut, which is also a co-sponsor of this organization, also does do a lot of work within the Bohra community on this issue. So just to give you some context about the agenda for today, we are going to be first and foremost doing a formal Q&A with Farzana, who you'll get to meet in just a few minutes. And then what we were hoping to do was to have an audience Q&A, so you'll all get a chance to ask Farzana some questions as well. And then we wanted to make this really interactive, and so we wanted to have a group discussion around the themes that we'll be exploring throughout the formal Q&A and the audience Q&A. And then what we hope to do is send a follow-up after that to let you all, if you want to link to this recording or any resources that might have been mentioned, if you want information about that, we can share that information. We also are really excited to announce that we are doing a book giveaway of Farzana's book, and at the end of the event today, we'll be able to announce who that particular winner is. So everyone who registered for the webinar is automatically enrolled in that book giveaway too. So with that, I am going to now introduce Farzana. So Farzana is an award-winning Canadian writer who is a writer and psychotherapist. Oh, so sorry. I'm having some technical issues right now. Farzana is an award-winning Canadian writer and activist and psychotherapist, and her writing really often explores themes such as relationships, loss, healing, racism, feminism, and LGBTQ identity. She was recently named one of the 100 writers in Canada you need to know, and she is also the co-founder of the organization WeSpeakOut. And her book, which we're going to be talking about today, is called Seven, and it is exploring the often complicated relationship between modern and traditional customs and the struggle to end the practice of khatna, which is what FGC is often referred to in the Bohra community. And Vivek Shraya, an author of I'm Afraid of Men, described Seven as an urgent and passionate read. And I've also read the book, so I can definitely tell you that this is something that you will want to check out if you have not read it already. So with that, Farzana, I would love to welcome you. And if you would like to introduce yourself to the group.
I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so much, Mariya. And thank you all of you for being here today. I'm really looking forward to the group part of the conversation because we've got a nice, intimate number here to talk about things that I think we don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about. So I'm really glad you're here. All of what Mariya said, I'm a social worker and writer, and I joined WeSpeakOut. I was one of the founding members of WeSpeakOut back in 2015, and I've mostly taken a very back seat role. I've been the Twitter handler and been part of a core group of people who are working on this issue. And it's only in the recent like the last 6 months or so that I've kind of come forward to be a little bit more public about being a survivor and talking about these issues. And I attended the Sahiyo retreat a year and a half ago, and it was really helpful for me for like framing how was I going to prepare myself to launch this book and to come forward to speak about it. So it's a little bit about me. I live in Toronto. Yeah.
Great. Well, Farzana, I'm so glad to have you here again. So I turned off our share screen just so that you can actually see Farzana and me on the screen as we're having this conversation. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to start off with asking what really inspired you to write this book?
I think it was getting involved in the activism, but for me, writing is a bit more magical than that. So, I might have intellectually an idea in my head, but what was also happening at that time, I was very busy promoting my third novel, and so I didn't have a lot of time for writing. But I found that I had these like fully formed fictional scenes kind of leaking out of me. And so with my morning coffee, I was just writing these scenes into a notebook because I knew I had to capture something. And I think that was really the beginnings of the novel. And at the same time, I was really struggling with kind of understanding like where I sat personally with khatna. At first, I think because it was something that was so suppressed in my life, I really at first questioned like, did this really happen to me? I think this happened to me. Oh my God, this happened to me, So all of that was happening. It was a very busy emotional year for me, but that's what inspired it. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I can definitely relate just as a writer and trying to talk about this issue. It is something that isn't the easiest to deal with. And I think that sitting down and, processing it and trying to figure out, I'm amazed that you were able to turn it into fiction in this way as well.
I think fiction for me, because I've been a fiction writer for many years, this is my fourth book, I really feel like it's the comfortable place for me because you can be a little bit distant from your own experience. You're writing a character, you're just one step removed emotionally, right? You're talking about the character's experience, not your own, even though there might be links, there's obviously links.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, I've often heard that fiction in a way allows you to also talk about emotional truths in a way that feels safer than a memoir does. And oftentimes you can focus in and really what is it that you are trying to convey by bringing up this issue or having a character deal with that in that certain context, and it can feel safer too.
Yeah. It's safer, and it's also I feel like sometimes an easier way to bring political and like difficult subjects forward, because you know the packaging of a novel is something that is quite pleasant to read and interesting and maybe even fun to read, and then woven in is the difficult stuff. So it's a sneaky way of kind of educating people.
I think it's a great way to educate people. I might be biased, but I think it is. So speaking of your writing and then just thinking about some of your characters, the main character's great-grandfather really pops up into this book in, short vignettes throughout the book, which I really liked that you did that. Can you talk about why you decided to format the book in that way?
Yeah, and initially I didn't have that. Like the premise of the book is that the main character is going to India, and she thinks she's going to be doing research on this ancestor and homeschooling her kid at the same time. And then she ends up finding out about other things like khatna, because it's 2016 at the time. So initially I wasn't going to have him coming up in vignettes, but he was really kind of coming alive in my mind, and I just wanted to have his voice in there. And I really think that like khatna is this issue of inheritance. This is intergenerational violence that's been passed down and passed down, in our context, in the Bohra context. So I wanted to kind of look at like where does this, how would a great grandfather, how would he be part of this issue too? And just a little bit of backstory. Around 2015, I was doing some research about my own great grandfather. Couldn't find out too much about his own personal life. I learned about the frame of his world, but nobody I talked to had known him because he had died in 1920. So I knew I wanted to write him, but I didn't want to mess with my own family's reverence for the real person. So I turned him into a fictional character. But some of the scenes that people will read are very much inspired on the real life of my own great grandpa.
That's pretty amazing. So just if I can ask a follow-up question, since you mentioned you were doing research on your own great-grandfather, how did you, or what were processes or methods you did to really ensure that those vignettes, which take place in that time period, so of the time period of your great-grandfather, felt authentic in terms of obviously modern, during this time, we have things like cell phones, technology, and everything, and you want to have a certain authenticity to that particular time period. Do you have, could you share with us any processes or methods that you used?
Well, so the basic story of my own great grandfather, which then I turned into this fiction, came from hearing stories in my own family. So I went around and asked people what they had heard from their parents. And then I have a relative in India who is kind of the keeper of the family history, has the whole tree and had his will and all of that kind of stuff. So I could go and get some of that information from her. And I created actually a blog for the family. It's hassanali.wordpress.com if anyone wants to see the real guy. So I collected stories, but then I needed to go and do my own internet research, right? To I have the character reading a newspaper, and I needed to go find out like which newspaper would he possibly be reading.
Yeah.
I needed to kind of figure out like what was the neighborhood that he might be living in back then. I needed to think about like what plagues were happening back then. So I had to do a lot of internet research, and all of that I just kind of wove in and to create fiction.
Yeah. That sounds great. I'm working on a novel that one day will be published, but it's historical in that way. So I'm always curious about what authors do to try to make that time period setting feel authentic.
You go like into all of these like Google like rabbit holes, and then something pops up, some like very delicious detail, and then you can weave it in. It's It's actually pretty fun, but very time consuming.
Yeah, I can imagine. um, so just talking about, or thinking about some of your other characters, your main character in particular really grapples with her own sex life throughout the novel and her marriage, and then later on with the issue of FGC or khatna. Can you talk about why you brought all those themes together?
Yeah, I think we talk as activists, we talk a lot about the harms, but we don't very much, I think, get into the details around the emotional and sexual harms. I think that's still kind of taboo for us to talk about, just like khatna is taboo to talk about. I don't think most of us are very comfortable talking about sex. We live in this very kind of sex negative culture. And I mean that broadly, like even North America is a very sex negative culture. So we don't really learn how to talk about sexuality in a very detailed or comfortable way. So that was one of my um, hidden agendas for the book as well. Not so hidden. I wanted to be able to address this issue. So, the novel starts where she talks a little bit about her backstory around having had an emotional online affair and how that's had an impact on her marriage. And the marriage is, they have decided to move on, and they are continuing in their marriage, but that tension is still in the background. As a therapist, I'm very interested in infidelity and its long-term impacts, just as a side note. So that's how it starts. But, she's a woman who has never had an orgasm alone or with a lover, and she doesn't really understand why. And through the book, she starts to understand some of the impacts of khatna on her. Um, but I wanted to make sure that I talked about the diversity of experiences of khatna survivors, right? Because some people will say it has had no impact on me at all, emotionally or sexually, which is wonderful. Other people will say, I think maybe it's had an impact, but I'm not sure. Other people, and we're going to talk to this group to see what your experiences are. And some people have said, it's had a major impact. So I have characters who talk about all of that. And I wanted to make sure that there was sort of this representation of all of that. And through the book, there's also some discussion about sexual healing, and even, how can a husband or a partner be an ally in that healing as well. And I wanted to present that. I don't think that's a very common experience that people have. And I hope lots of partners of survivors read this book so that they can just get a glimpse into what does that look like.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up that one thing that I appreciated about your book was the fact that you did have women who had experienced FGC or khatna in diverse ways. And just with Sahiyo, a lot of our work revolves around the idea of storytelling. And one of the reasons that we do that is because we do recognize that there are many different impacts and experiences, whether it is physical, sexual, mental health, emotional, and that we want to really recognize that no experience is invalid, and that we want to break stereotypes about FGC in terms of how harmful it is. And one of those stereotypes that, unfortunately, I think you see this in other forms of gender-based violence, particularly in sexual assault and rape, is that there is one certain form of FGC and one impact, and that it is always this, when you're looking at media perceptions and you're first coming across it, it's this very brutal, harmful issue. And I'm not saying that it's not harmful, and I'm not saying that it's not brutal for some folks, or if they choose to describe it that way. But I do think, like you mentioned, we have heard from survivors who don't believe they've had any negative impacts, or it could also be that they're just not aware, or there might not be enough research out there in terms of the mental health, emotional impact. And I think that
Sometimes I think it's really subtle too, right? My character in the book, like she has had like quite a sex life. She's had, a few partners. And, so she wouldn't say that it's had an extreme impact on her life, but it's subtle. And I wanted to talk about the subtleties. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the diversity and the experiences is I have characters who have no memory of it, who have a little bit of memory, and then a very kind of clear narrative kind of memory. And I wanted to get into that too, because um, I'm very thankful to the people who have come forward to tell their stories, but sometimes there can be a single narrative. And I think some of the single narratives that we're seeing across all forms of FGC, like, all four categories, are the people who have this very clear, linear narrative to share. And I wanted to make sure that I had women in this story who have all different ways of remembering and not remembering, because I think we need to kind of talk about how common it is to dissociate memories as well. And so often it's those people who don't have the clear linear narrative, who are very dissociative, who are not on the stage speaking about this experience. And so we don't hear from them enough. So
I agree.
fiction is a great way to do that, right? Because you can have as many characters as you want. You can make
Yeah.
up whatever you want.
Definitely. But it all is also still based in truth of some sort, because you're very familiar. I mean, not only as someone connected personally to this issue, but also hearing the stories of other women. So there is that basis of truth that that these are experiences people are having. So you're able to like drive in and like highlight that, which I think is really helpful. And I mean, one of the growing up for me when I was starting to learn about this issue, I couldn't find anything about it in the Bohra community specifically. Unfortunately, what I would always hear about is it happening within African communities or African diaspora communities, which yes, it does. I think it's really important to recognize that, but the global nature of the issue wasn't brought out into the open. And I can't imagine what it had been like if I had been growing up and had access to your book and was able to read it as well. So
I wish I'd read the book 20 years ago. Someone else had written it. Yeah.
All right. So just wanted to ask you another question. I think we're just kind of building on each of them, but this is one of the few books, again, that really addresses this issue within the Bohra community. And it's not just about khatna or FGC, but it's also about orthodoxy in general. So could you please explain a little bit about why did you decide to highlight that? Why was it important to you to embed that in this novel?
Yeah, I think the reason why some of the negative practices, some of the harmful to women practices continue is because of an orthodoxy that we have where we're not really supposed to question anything. And I kind of straddle a couple of different worlds. My dad, as a young man, renounced the religion, which is very complicated, right? In a Bohra context, we didn't get shunned in a very deliberate kind of way because we were living in Canada and his family ties were still strong. And I think there's a way that when you're far away, your family can still keep contact with you, even though they're Orthodox. And my mom was lukewarm to the religion. And so I kind of learned a whole bunch of things. I learned about my dad's negativity towards the religion, my mom's lukewarmness, and then the larger extended family, quite a lot of people were Orthodox, particularly on his side of the family. So I kind of wanted to explore like belief and faith, and there's a lot of people, I think, in our community who are in this middle place of enjoying the religion, enjoying the community, believing some of it, but then not wanting to speak up against the orthodoxy, even though they whisper to themselves about how they don't agree with lots of things. So I just wanted to surface that, because I think when we normalize all of this, khatna, sexuality, faith, once we normalize these conversations, they're so much easier to have out in the open.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you as well too. I think there is power in taking things that were silenced and putting it into the public sphere as well.
That's what all the stories are about, right? Like, yeah.
Definitely. You made me think of while you were speaking, that one of the other things about your book, besides having characters that have different experiences of FGC in their adult lives, you also have characters that have different levels of devotion or orthodoxy in terms of how connected they are to the Bohra community. And they have different views in terms of how they feel about FGC. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because they are a devout Bohra community member, that they necessarily absolutely agree with FGC too. So could you talk a little bit about why you chose to highlight that or have that diversity in characters?
I really wanted to be careful about like stereotyping, right? So I do have a more orthodox character who thinks that khatna is just a normal, natural process. I have, other characters who pop up, minor characters like an old orthodox guy who, congratulates his, activist niece, about her work. So like I wanted to have a range because I really think that in our community there is a range. So people can be quite orthodox in their beliefs, but also say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore to my daughter or to my granddaughter. And then there can be people who are not very orthodox, but follow along because they haven't really thought about it and they don't really feel, they might not have been educated about the harms, right? One of the things that I think I've really understood after 5 years of activism, I didn't in the first year, I was just raging all the time. And I think that happens for a lot of people. When you first start to get involved, you're just so, it's like everything is black and white. And I think it's actually such a big, nuanced issue. And I really understand today that I don't think anybody sets out to harm anybody in this. The people who continue the practice are people who are thinking that they're helping their kids. And
Yeah,
I need to set that out in the novel too.
yeah, and that's very true. That's something that we hear all the time too, that especially people who are very, what I like the term pro FGC or pro khatna, expressing that this is something that's beneficial and supportive. And why would we want to harm our children? Nobody wants to harm their children. And that's a layer of complexity in terms of like when you're trying to create social change, how do you deal with that kind of conversation or that mentality?
And some of those pro-Khatna people, like you probably have seen with Sahiyo, but we really felt it with WeSpeakOut. We've been like trolled pretty heavily on Twitter in the last number of months. That has stopped for some reason, which I'm very curious about. But we were trolled pretty heavily, and they would be really insulting to us and say, "Well, you're not even part of the community," and they would make up myths like this actually helps people's sexuality. It was very upsetting. But I don't think most of the people who believe that khatna is okay are those people.
Yeah.
I think those people on Twitter are somehow like pretty extreme.
Yeah, I hope so.
I hope so too. Yeah.
So we're actually at the end of our formal Q&A, but thank you so much for chatting and telling us a little bit about your book.